Behind the veil of relationship harmony lies a strategic reality few dare acknowledge. The subtle power contest Machiavelli recognized centuries before modern psychology had language to describe it. Within his lesser-known writings, Niccolò Machiavelli documented specific mechanisms through which certain women systematically gain psychological advantage over men, not through force but through sophisticated emotional leverage that remains invisible until control is already established. This documentary exposes the tactical patterns Machiavelli identified during Renaissance court observations, revealing how these ancient strategies continue operating in modern relationships beneath conscious awareness. This isn't about gender conflict but rather strategic recognition, understanding power dynamics that operate regardless of acknowledgement. If you've ever found yourself unconsciously surrendering autonomy in relationships without understanding why, subscribe now to discover the psychological mechanisms that Machiavelli recognized 5 centuries before they became the foundation of modern influence psychology. The average American relationship contains approximately 270 influence attempts weekly, most occurring without conscious awareness by either party. This isn't speculative philosophy, but documented psychology. Research from the University of Washington's Relationship Lab reveals that only about 17% of these influence dynamics register consciously, creating what psychologists call perception asymmetry, where significant control exchanges occur beneath recognition threshold. This hidden battlefield exists not because of malicious intent, but rather due to fundamental human psychology. Dr. Robert Cialdini, whose pioneering research on influence mechanisms revolutionized our understanding of persuasion, explains, "The most effective influence occurs when the target remains unaware they're being influenced. Once influence becomes visible, psychological reactance automatically activates. This creates the paradoxical situation where the most powerful control dynamics in relationships are precisely those neither person acknowledges." Machiavelli recognized this pattern centuries before modern psychology had language to describe it. While serving as Florence's diplomatic advisor from 1498 to 1512, he observed the subtle power contests operating behind the facade of Renaissance court etiquette. What fascinated him wasn't overt power plays, but rather the invisible influence patterns that determined actual control while maintaining the appearance of equality, or even deference. The contemporary reluctance to acknowledge these dynamics creates what social psychologists call strategic blindness, deliberately not seeing patterns that would require uncomfortable recognition. Harvard researcher Dr. Jennifer Eberhardt's work on selective perception demonstrates how powerfully motivation shapes awareness, creating blind spots precisely where recognition would require challenging established narratives. Neurological research explains why these dynamics remain hidden. Dr. Antonio Damasio's studies on decision-making demonstrate that influence operates primarily through what neuroscientists call somatic markers, bodily sensations that guide choices below conscious awareness. This creates what Damasio calls non-conscious decision biasing that occurs faster than rational thought can intercept, allowing influence to occur without triggering awareness. The gender dimension introduces particular complexity. Evolutionary psychologists note that physical power imbalances throughout human history necessitated the development of alternative influence strategies. As Dr. Joyce Benenson of Harvard explains, when direct confrontation poses physical risk, indirect influence naturally develops as an adaptive strategy. This evolutionary pattern created sophisticated psychological mechanisms that operate through relationship dynamics rather than direct confrontation. These influence patterns aren't universal but rather contextual. Dr. Deborah Tannen's sociolinguistic research demonstrates that specific control tactics emerge based on available leverage points within particular relationship structures. This creates what Tannen calls strategic adaptation, the development of influence approaches that exploit the specific vulnerabilities present in individual relationships. What makes Machiavelli's perspective particularly valuable is his dispassionate analytical approach. Unlike contemporary discussions that often devolve into moral judgment or gender politics, Machiavelli documented these patterns with clinical precision, not to condemn, but to understand. This analytical stance created what historians call strategic clarity, seeing relationship dynamics as they actually function rather than as we wish they would. Modern research validates his observations. Stanford psychologist Dr. Marianne Lafrance's studies on nonverbal dominant signals demonstrate that relationship control often operates through what she calls micropolitics, subtle behavioral patterns that establish power dynamics without triggering conscious recognition. These include specific conversational control techniques, emotional leveraging, and what LaFrance terms selective reinforcement, rewarding or withholding approval based on compliance. What makes these dynamics particularly effective is their operation through positive mechanisms rather than negative ones. As social psychologist Dr. Jonathan Haidt explains, we easily recognize attempts to control through criticism or demand, but remain largely blind to control through selective praise or affection. This creates what Haidt calls the invisibility of positive control, influence strategies that operate through reward rather than punishment, making them particularly difficult to detect. The relationship implications are significant. Couples researcher Dr. John Gottman's work demonstrates that unconscious power struggles represent the third most common factor in relationship dissatisfaction, yet remain the least discussed in couples therapy. This creates what Gottman calls the invisible relationship stressor, tension that neither party can address directly because neither fully recognizes its operation. In the ornate chambers of Renaissance, Florence's Palazzo Vecchio, Niccolò Machiavelli observed power dynamics that few dared acknowledge. While his famous work The Prince focused on political power, his private correspondence and lesser-known writings reveal equally astute observations about interpersonal influence, particularly the sophisticated strategies through which certain women gained psychological leverage over powerful men without appearing to seek control. What makes these observations particularly valuable is their historical context. Renaissance Florence operated under strict patriarchal structures that granted men formal authority, while creating what historians call power displacement, the development of alternative influence channels when direct authority is unavailable. This environment provided Machiavelli a unique laboratory for observing how control operates through relationship dynamics, rather than formal structures. Historian Lauro Martinez notes the significance of these observations. Machiavelli's genius lay in recognizing influence patterns that others either missed entirely or refused to acknowledge. While his contemporaries focused on formal power hierarchies, Machiavelli documented the subtle mechanisms through which actual psychological control was established and maintained regardless of official position. The historical record reveals Machiavelli's particular interest in what he called the strategic use of affection, the deployment of emotional connections as influence vectors, rather than merely as expressions of genuine feeling. In letters to Francesco Vittori, he described specific instances where powerful men made significant political concessions based on relationship pressures without recognizing the strategic nature of the influence being exerted. What distinguished Machiavelli's analysis was his recognition that these dynamics operated without conscious calculation by either party. As Renaissance scholar John Najemi explains, Machiavelli didn't view these patterns as deliberate manipulation, but rather as ingrained strategic behaviors that evolved through social necessity. His insight was recognizing their operation regardless of conscious intent, understanding that influence patterns function based on effectiveness rather than awareness. Modern psychology validates this perspective. Dr. Tanya Chartrand's research on automatic social behavior demonstrates that influence strategies develop and operate largely outside conscious awareness. Her studies on what she calls strategic mimicry show that people unconsciously adopt behaviors that have previously succeeded in gaining social advantage, creating influence patterns that function without deliberate planning. Machiavelli's observations focused particularly on what he termed strategic vulnerability, the calculated display of apparent weakness that activates protective responses while establishing psychological leverage. He noted how certain court ladies would present carefully calibrated helplessness in specific contexts, creating what modern psychologists call the protector response, a powerful psychological trigger that establishes relationship patterns where one person unconsciously surrenders autonomy to fulfill the protector role. The historical context provided Machiavelli unique perspective on what sociologists call adaptive power strategies, influence approaches that develop under conditions where direct authority is unavailable. Renaissance court dynamics created a perfect laboratory for observing how psychological leverage operates when formal power is constrained, revealing patterns that remain relevant across vastly different social contexts. What made Machiavelli's insights particularly revolutionary was his recognition that these influence dynamics operated through predictable psychological mechanisms rather than through individual personalities. This perspective anticipated modern social psychology by nearly 5 centuries, viewing relationship patterns as strategic systems rather than as expressions of personal character. Modern research confirms this systematic nature. Dr. Robert Cialdini's studies on influence principles demonstrate that persuasion operates through specific psychological triggers that function consistently across diverse contexts. His identification of principles like reciprocity, commitment, social proof, liking, authority, and scarcity reveals the same mechanistic nature of influence that Machiavelli observed in Renaissance courts. Through meticulous observation of Renaissance court dynamics, Machiavelli identified 3 primary mechanisms through which psychological control was established and maintained in relationships. What makes these patterns particularly valuable to recognize is their continued operation in modern contexts, despite vastly different social structures. The first mechanism involves what Machiavelli called strategic intermittence, the calculated alternation between affection and distance that creates psychological dependency through variable reinforcement. Modern neuroscience explains why this approach proves so effective. Dr. Robert Sapolsky's research demonstrates that unpredictable reward patterns trigger dopamine release patterns that create what neuroscientists call reinforcement addiction, a powerful neurological dependency that establishes profound psychological leverage. Behavioral studies confirm this effect. Dr. Kelly McGonigal's research at Stanford shows that variable reinforcement creates stronger behavioral conditioning than consistent reinforcement by a factor of approximately 3.1. This creates what psychologists call the intermittent reward trap, a relationship dynamic where unpredictable positive reinforcement establishes stronger control than either consistent positivity or negativity could achieve. Corporate America has institutionalized this insight. Sales training programs now explicitly teach what they call strategic accessibility management, controlling availability to clients to create precisely the variable reinforcement pattern that maximizes psychological leverage. Internal training documents from major consulting firms reveal specific protocols for alternating between high responsiveness and calculated delays to establish what they term client dependency patterns. The second mechanism Machiavelli identified involves what he termed information asymmetry, establishing relationship patterns where one person consistently discloses more than the other, creating both vulnerability and interpretive advantage. Modern relationship researcher Dr. John Gottman's studies confirm that disclosure imbalances correlate strongly with decision-making control, creating what Gottman calls the information leverage effect. This pattern operates through what social psychologists call the vulnerability loop, where emotional disclosure creates connection but also establishes leverage when reciprocation remains asymmetrical. Dr. Brené Brown's research demonstrates that vulnerability functions as both an emotional bonding mechanism and a potential control vector, creating complex dynamics that often operate below conscious awareness. The corporate world has weaponized this insight. Negotiation training now explicitly teaches what is called strategic disclosure calibration, carefully managing information sharing to establish negotiating advantage. Consultant James Altucher describes this as the disclosure ratio, recommending that effective negotiators maintain approximately a 2.5 ratio of personal disclosure to extraction, creating connection while maintaining information advantage. The third mechanism Machiavelli observed involves what he called selective reinforcement, providing or withholding approval based on compliance with unstated expectations. Modern behavioral psychology explains why this approach proves so effective. Dr. B.F. Skinner's research on operant conditioning demonstrated that targeted reinforcement creates behavioral patterns that persist even when the subject remains unaware of the conditioning process. Relationship studies confirm this effect. Dr. John Gottman's research reveals that approval patterns establish what he calls behavior funneling, gradually narrowing acceptable behavior ranges through selective reinforcement without explicit discussion of expectations. This creates relationship dynamics where one person increasingly adjusts to the other's preferences without conscious recognition of the underlying influence pattern. The business world has systematized this approach. Management training programs teach what they call cultural compliance engineering, establishing workplace behavioral norms through selective recognition and advancement rather than explicit directives. This creates what organizational psychologists call invisible expectation structures that shape behavior more effectively than formal policies. What unifies these three mechanisms is their operation beneath conscious awareness. Unlike direct control attempts that trigger what psychologists call reactance, automatic resistance to perceived freedom threats, these approaches establish influence patterns without activating defensive responses. This creates what social scientists call non-resistant compliance, behavioral alignment that occurs without triggering awareness of being influenced. The gender dimension introduces particular complexity. Research from Dr. Deborah Tannen demonstrates that men and women often employ different influence strategies based on socialized patterns, creating what Tannen calls cross-style misinterpretation, where influence attempts by one gender may not be recognized as such by the other due to different strategic expectations. Corporate application reveals how these mechanisms transcend gender. Executive coach Olivia Fox-Cabane teaches what she calls strategic warmth deployment, using positive emotional connection as a calculated influence vector. Her client data shows this approach increases compliance with requests by approximately 61% compared to direct approaches, regardless of the gender of either party. What distinguishes these mechanisms from simple manipulation is their bilateral nature. As relationship researcher Dr. Sue Johnson explains, these patterns typically develop as reciprocal systems where both parties unconsciously participate rather than as deliberate strategies implemented by one person against another. This creates what Johnson calls reinforcing influence loops that become self-sustaining relationship dynamics. Despite vast social changes since Renaissance Florence, the psychological mechanisms Machiavelli identified continue operating in contemporary relationships with remarkable consistency. Modern manifestations appear through updated tactics that leverage the same underlying psychological principles. The workplace provides clear examples. Organizational psychologist Dr. Adam Grant's research identifies what he calls influence style adaptation, the development of context-specific approaches based on available leverage points. His studies show that in environments where formal authority is limited, people naturally develop alternative influence strategies that operate through relationship dynamics rather than direct instruction. Corporate America has systematized these insights. Leadership training programs now explicitly teach indirect influence methodology, establishing control through relationship leverage rather than positional authority. This approach creates what organizational psychologists call perceived alignment, where others make choices that align with your preferences while maintaining the perception of autonomous decision-making. The dating world offers particularly visible examples. Relationship coach Matthew Hussey teaches high-value behavior patterns, specific approaches that establish psychological leverage through strategic intermittence, controlled vulnerability, and selective approval. His client data shows these approaches increase relationship investment by potential partners by approximately 43% compared to direct interest expression. Digital technology has amplified these dynamics. Social media has enabled strategic availability management, controlling online response patterns to create precisely the variable reinforcement that Machiavelli identified as establishing psychological dependency. The approach creates attention leverage, the ability to command disproportionate psychological investment through calculated engagement patterns. What makes these modern manifestations particularly effective is their alignment with contemporary values. As social psychologist Dr. Robert Cialdini explains, today's influence strategies succeed by appearing to embody autonomy and authenticity while actually establishing subtle control patterns. This creates what Cialdini calls the freedom illusion, the perception of independent choice within carefully constructed influence architectures. What distinguishes these modern manifestations from simple manipulation is their often unconscious nature. As Harvard psychologist Dr. Ellen Langer explains, most people implementing these influence patterns aren't consciously manipulating others but rather engaging in behaviors that have been rewarded through past effectiveness. This creates strategic habituation, the development of influence approaches through evolutionary reinforcement rather than calculated planning. Recognizing influence patterns represents only the first step toward establishing healthier relationship dynamics. Effective response requires specific strategies that address the psychological mechanisms involved, rather than merely reacting to surface behaviors. The process begins with what social scientists call pattern recognition, systematically identifying influence dynamics within specific relationships. Relationship researcher Dr. John Gottman recommends the influence inventory, documenting decision patterns, emotional responses, and behavioral adjustments to reveal underlying control structures that may operate below awareness threshold. The second countermeasure involves pattern interruption, deliberately breaking established influence cycles to create new relationship dynamics. Couples therapist Dr. Harriet Lerner recommends the pattern break protocol, identifying repeated interaction sequences and intentionally introducing alternative responses that disrupt established control loops. Practical application includes what relationship coach Matthew Hussey calls the recalibration technique, establishing new interaction patterns through consistent behavioral shifts rather than through direct confrontation. This approach creates non-resistant pattern change, relationship transformation that occurs without triggering defensive responses that often strengthen existing dynamics. The third countermeasure involves transparency establishment, bringing unconscious influence patterns into explicit discussion. Dr. Brené Brown's research demonstrates that naming previously unacknowledged dynamics reduces their psychological power, creating the awareness effect, diminished impact of influence mechanisms once they become consciously recognized. The fourth countermeasure involves reciprocity balancing, systematically equalizing disclosure, vulnerability, and emotional investment within relationships. Dr. John Gottman's research demonstrates that deliberate reciprocity creates influence equilibrium, relationship patterns where control remains dynamic rather than becoming fixed in asymmetrical structures. Practical application includes the disclosure balance, consciously calibrating personal sharing to match rather than exceed the other person's openness. This technique creates vulnerability equity, equal emotional exposure that prevents the development of information-based control dynamics. What unifies these countermeasures is their focus on establishing conscious choice, rather than reactive resistance. Unlike defensive approaches that often strengthen existing dynamics through opposition, these strategies create pattern transcendence, moving beyond established influence loops into new relationship structures based on mutual awareness and intentional engagement. The ultimate achievement isn't manipulation proofing, but rather establishing conscious engagement, interaction patterns where influence occurs through transparent processes rather than through unconscious mechanisms. This creates relationships characterized by informed autonomy, making choices with awareness of influence factors rather than through automatic responses to unrecognized triggers.